and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Kleesner, and I'm the Executive Director at Minnesota Brownfields. Next slide, please. We are a 501c3 organization dedicated to promoting brownfield redevelopment throughout the state of Minnesota. Next. We accomplish our mission through education, advocacy, networking, and community outreach. Today's program is an example of our partnership work with Kansas State University TAB, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the Minnesota Department of Economic Development and Employment, and the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Many of our members are local government representatives who are interested in finding new uses for contaminated properties. Part of our partnership with KSU TAB will be a follow-up in-person grant writing workshop on August 20th in St. Cloud. You can register for that event on the Minnesota Brownfields webpage under the Events tab. We believe that brownfield sites are assets, and there is a path forward to successful redevelopment. Minnesota is a state with many resources supporting the financing stack and regulatory navigation to successfully clean up and find new use for these properties. If you are in Hennepin or Ramsey counties, Minnesota Brownfields administers a grant program intended to fund Phase 1 and Phase 2 assessments. These grants are often the first step to building a successful coalition to develop a project. Juxtaposition Arts in Minneapolis and the Belfry Affordable Housing Project in Minneapolis are two recent success stories from our grant program. We have a terrific agenda for you today. Next slide, please. And our agenda highlights all of the critical elements of a successful brownfield project. All of these partners can help you to build a financing and cleanup plan that will benefit the sites in your communities. We look forward to continuing to work with all of you to ensure that our Minnesota communities have access to the information and knowledge necessary to integrate brownfields into their economic development plans. We look forward to seeing you in August. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Kristen Prososki, KSU TAB Minnesota Coordinator. She has an impressive resume of working with Minnesota state and local governments and in the private sector on brownfield projects. We are thrilled to have her as our Minnesota point of contact for KSU TAB. Kristen, next slide, please.
Thanks, Elizabeth. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm an assistant regional director with KSU TAB for EPA regions 5 and 7. And I'll just be going over some brownfield basics. So just kind of setting the stage and making sure we're all on the same page as far as terminology. Next slide, please. So just a couple of quick ground rules. If you are experiencing any kind of technical issues, please feel free to call or email the contact information provided. And also know that the presentation is being recorded and will be available on the website. Next slide. A couple of Zoom related items. If you could ensure that your video remains off during the presentation, that would be great. And also it'd be appreciated if you could change your name to match how you registered if it isn't showing that way already. Next slide. And you'll learn more about the TAB program, but just wanted to mention right now that it is a nationwide program. It's funded through an EPA grant to provide technical assistance to communities. Kansas State University does cover EPA regions 5, 6, 7, and 8. Next slide, please. So again, for setting the stage, just looking at what is a brownfield, and that isn't common terminology for everyone. If you don't work in the industry, it maybe is something you've heard of but aren't really sure, or maybe there are people certainly who have never really heard of that. And what it means is that it's a property that has contamination, or people think it might have contamination, and it makes it difficult to reinvest or redevelop in that site. And the contamination can be in the ground or in the soil, in the groundwater, or within a building. Next slide. So there's many different types of brownfield sites. And this list certainly provides a good overview. There's others as well. And many communities, or most communities, would have examples of sites that prove to be pretty challenging to redevelop. And a lot of that has to do with the unknowns about the property. Next slide. So here's some photos of different brownfield sites. As you can see, some are more obvious than others. Next slide. And it really does come back to the perception. So it can be the perception that stops a project from moving forward because people are just worried about what's there and how much is it going to cost, even without knowing exactly what's there and how much it's going to cost. Next slide. And removing those unknowns can really help a project to advance more quickly. So this is one example in Minnesota where this property went tax forfeit. The county had to navigate, what do we do with this? It didn't sell at auction. And part of that was the unknowns. So the county was able to get grant funding from the MPCA, investigate the site, figure out what was there, or in this case, what wasn't there. There actually wasn't impacts that needed to be addressed during redevelopment. So it was able to move forward much more quickly and sold at the next auction. Next slide. I did want to mention, though, that not all brownfields are obvious. So when you first look at this site, it doesn't scream brownfield, at least not to me, but it is. And so, past use, even though it doesn't visually look like it, the past use of an old resort from decades ago and their refueling station actually caused impacts to the site. But again, by identifying that, yes, there are issues, the building was able to be designed with a system to ensure that the building was safe, and they were able to secure deed grant funding to allow the project to proceed. Next slide. So just kind of want to talk a little bit about how did this start? So CERCLA was really put in place to try to address environmental and health risks that were posed by contamination, or specifically by industrial pollution. Before that, there was not authority to address issues, whether it was an emergency or a cleanup of a former industrial site. The authority just didn't exist, and it was leading to really negative outcomes. So one infamous example is Love Canal in New York, and that was redeveloped with no investigation, no cleanup, no oversight, and had really terrible outcomes for the people impacted by that property. So CERCLA was put in place to address those types of issues. CERCLA's liability is joint, strict, and several, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So the CERCLA liability, basically what it means is if you ever owned or operated at a site, you could be held liable for the contamination there. And it doesn't matter if you weren't there when the activity was happening that caused the contamination, that doesn't separate you from the liability of that. And so, that got to be, it was necessary in order to advance, to be able to address some of the issues that were coming up, but it also could be scary for a potential buyer. Next slide. There is a pathway forward. We'll learn more about that today as well. But from a developer perspective, they're looking at the opportunity versus the risk. So brownfield sites are often in really great locations. There was a reason that activity located there in the past. Sometimes the site issues may result in a reduced price. They're in areas where there's existing infrastructure and you're not having to pay the extra money to extend infrastructure, and communities aren't having to, increase their operating area for that. But they're weighing that against the risks, and the liability is a huge risk, a huge potential risk, as well as the cleanup costs and the extra time that's needed. And so, next slide. So then, maybe somebody would wonder, why bother? Why bother with, liability risk and the extra cost and the extra time? And really, it's because there's so many benefits to brownfield redevelopment. And these programs exist because there's a common agreement that great things happen when brownfield sites are redeveloped. It mitigates the health and environmental issues, can reduce blight within a community. It can, sometimes result in a property tax increase or new jobs to the area. And again, that infill development. So it's not always an expansion and the more expense of expanded infrastructure and expanded services. Next slide. Other benefits that are maybe more particular to a potential developer, it can eliminate or reduce some of that upfront out-of-pocket costs. So it'd maybe make it more enticing to even consider a brownfield property by having some of the costs paid for. Again, the liability assurance piece is huge. That's something that, a developer, that any property owner is going to want who's taking on a brownfield site. And again, the assessment helps to quantify, if there are issues there, it quantifies them and helps create a path forward for that. Next slide. So there's also benefits to the owner of the property. It can help the sale move forward faster in many cases, like that example, previous example of a gas station. Knowing that there weren't issues helped it to be sold faster. If you're the seller and you have that information to provide, maybe you're able to say there are no issues, or it's limited and it's, kind of estimated at this cost. You're able to at least talk about known factors, and that can help with the pricing. On the other hand, if you're the buyer and there are identified issues, you can hopefully negotiate price based on that. And just overall increases the marketability. Next slide. So the brownfield laws and incentives, there's the liability protection, which again is huge for somebody who wants to purchase, who's a prospective purchaser. And we'll talk specifically about what that looks like to get the liability protection. And then there's also funding opportunities for assessment and cleanup, and in some cases redevelopment as well. Next slide. So just general steps of the brownfield redevelopment process are to plan, investigate, and then redevelop. Next slide. So within the planning, looking at who identifies properties as brownfields, and just know that you wouldn't be solely relying on EPA or MPCA or your county. Yes, they definitely would have information and would be willing to share and help. But it really can be community members. It would be residents who live and work within your area, your town, and they're the ones that can say, boy, we'd really like to see something happening at that site. Or, a lot of times they know about past activities. EPA and MPCA don't know every single brownfield that's out there. So working with community members can be really valuable. Next slide. There's a lot of different ways that you can start to inventory brownfield sites or get a gauge of brownfield sites within your community. It can be talking with community stakeholders, looking at existing planning documents. Doing a windshield or walking survey can be a great way, especially when you're looking for it specifically. Things will come to your attention. Next slide. Site prioritization can be based on, what you feel like is the highest priority. So maybe it's part of a larger redevelopment area, or maybe it's sites that are the most visible in your community, or the ones that have owners who are willing to give access. Next slide. The next piece is to investigate. Next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about all appropriate inquiry, which is an EPA liability protection. Again, it's for somebody who's looking at purchasing a site or an adjacent landowner. And it's doing the due diligence or environmental assessment before they purchase the property. That piece is really important. And that basically just includes looking at what might be at the site. Next slide. So, the due diligence would include records review, maybe interviews with past owner or operators, a visual inspection. It doesn't include sampling, and then a roadmap it would be the base piece for a roadmap for future investigations. Next slide. I'll talk about a phase one, which is, is really the first piece or the first look. Again, it's a records review, looking at aerials, sandboard maps, databases that would have information. So it's a pretty extensive historic review of the property with a site walkthrough, but does not include sampling. It does also look at adjacent sites because they may have impacted the property. This is strongly, strongly, strongly recommended before purchase. But I do want to say that if you have a site that you're looking at and the purchase has already been done, there's still a pathway forward for it. So don't think that it's closed all the doors. It will have eliminated some if there was no due diligence done before purchase, but there's still a pathway forward for other options. Next slide. A phase two assessment is the sampling and testing. So it's really looking at the soil, groundwater, and air or vapor. What's there, how much, finding the extent and delineating it. So quantifying that. Next slide. And then if there is an issue there, cleanup planning would occur. So based on the phase two results and the proposed future development, the environmental consultant that you're working with would create the cleanup plan. And, it could include soil removal or remediation, maybe a vapor system, abatement within the interior of a building. Next slide. The third piece of redevelopment is the stakeholder and partners and financial resources. And I'll touch briefly on the stakeholders and partners. Next slide. So you really want to identify who your partners are, who makes up your team. And that can be staff from state and federal agencies. It could be within your own, city or county departments, working internally. You could have a regional development commission or a regional planning organization that might be a partner. Foundations, nonprofits, just other interested parties or stakeholders can be part of your team. And if you're not sure exactly what that would look like, feel free to reach out and ask us because we can help identify potential partners on your team. Next slide. All right, I'm going to turn things over to our expert panel to talk about resources, and we'll kick off with Martha Faust. So next slide.
Thanks, Kristen. Yes, I'm here on behalf of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So we are the main environmental organization in Minnesota. And I'm going to touch on a few things that there's some overlap with what Kristen talked about, but I want to just reinforce a few points that are of particular interest to our program. Next slide, please. The MPCA's mission is to protect and improve the environment and to enhance human health. Next slide. So first, just a little bit about our Brownfields program. It was set up by the Minnesota legislature to address liability concerns and to provide technical oversight for voluntary parties. And examples of voluntary parties include all of the types of organizations that are listed on the right. So private entities like developers, property and business owners, lenders, as well as local units of government, essentially anyone involved in buying, selling, financing, or redeveloping contaminated property. Next slide. And then a little bit more about our Brownfield program in terms of like the statutory authority. So we have two programs under the Brownfields umbrella. First, the Petroleum Brownfields program, which was established through the State Petroleum Tank Release Cleanup Act. And as you might imagine, it covers contaminants that are related to petroleum. And then the second program is our Voluntary Investigation and Cleanup Program, which was set up through the Minnesota Environmental Response and Liability Act, or MERLA. And it's essentially Minnesota's version of the Superfund law. And the VIC program covers all non-petroleum contaminants. Next slide. So Kristen already kind of talked about this, but there's a few things that I wanted to just kind of double back on to talk about that process of environmental site investigation, cleanup, and redevelopment. So let's move on to the next slide. So just a little bit more about due diligence. Kristen talked about it, but I want to reinforce on behalf of our agency that it's important, it's required by most commercial lenders, and it's important to help protect your financial investment as well as workers in the building, workers doing work underground, and providing liability protection to developers. And properties might look okay, but can have hidden and costly environmental issues. Let's go on to the next slide. So again, Kristen talked about this as well, but it's worth just a little bit more detail. It really is a records review. It does not have to anything to do with sampling materials on the site, but it's really just trying to establish that property ownership and history and identify potential recognized environmental conditions that would merit additional investigation. So depending on the outcome of that phase 1 environmental site assessment, you may move on to phase 2. Next slide. And as phase 2 involves actual sampling. So it may be any of the media listed on the right: soil, groundwater, soil vapor, subslab, soil vapor, and or building material samples to determine test for contaminants. And next slide, that leads to a phase 2 report. And depending on the findings of the phase 2 report, there may be cleanup that's indicated. In Minnesota, we refer to cleanup plans as response action plans, or RAPs. And when contaminants are found at levels that are greater than risk values, the cleanup plan is needed. It'll help really direct the cleanup in terms of how materials will be managed, any dewatering of the site, vapor mitigation systems, confirmation of the sampling plan, and a contingency plan. Next slide. We talked a little bit about liability assurances. I just want to reinforce that. I don't have time to go into all of the different types of liability assurances that MPCA provides. Oops, I just muted myself. So adding that to chat, and just want to emphasize that our program includes technical assistance and issuance of these liability assurance letters that are really important for project financing and confirming that the identified contamination does not pose a risk to human health or the environment based on the current or proposed property use. Next slide, please. We do have some funding at MPCA. Elizabeth mentioned funding that Minnesota Brownfields has for Hennepin and Ramsey County. MPCA has a grant from the US EPA for targeted brownfield assessments. Funds are limited, but you can see here on this slide the eligible applicants that range from private sector to public sector, tribal entities, community-based organizations, and the types of activities that those funds can be used for, including the investigation, sampling, response action plan, and payment of MPCA Brownfield program fees. The next slide shows our priorities for the grant. Next slide. So we are prioritizing funding sites located in environmental justice areas of concern. We can share a map with you to show you where that is if you're not familiar. We're looking to fund redevelopment sites. We're looking for evidence of community support. So you're working with the local government and affected neighborhoods and emerging developers, folks who have done 5 projects or less. And the last slide provides information. Next slide, with how to sign up for through GovDelivery for updates. We recommend to sign up for the remediation and environmental justice links. You'll find that information there. And turning it over now to Beth Grigsby from KSU TAB.
Thank you, Martha. That was great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to introduce the Kansas State University Technical Assistance to Brownfields and the type of services that we can provide to you free of charge. Next slide, please. And as Kristen mentioned earlier, the TAB program is a national program. We are funded through cooperative agreement with the US EPA. Kansas State University actually provides services to Region 5, 6, 7, and 8, as well as we also provide the tribal technical assistance on a national basis. That will start here soon. Next slide. So what do? Basically, our real mission is to build capacity of communities that are struggling with brownfields. So there's different ways to do that, different needs at different levels. We can provide services, as I mentioned, free of charge, for as small as maybe getting together with you and some community leaders and talk about brownfields, do some brownfields education, to as large as assisting you with pulling together community outreach or public meetings. We can help you identify initially, develop inventory and prioritization of your brownfields. Many times you don't really know what that is. And as you're more, I would say, sophisticated, help you with story maps. We can help you with engaging the community, setting redevelopment goals, identification of resources. We do a lot of that, resource roundtables and resource roadmaps for a community. Solar and green energy strategies are important. Economic feasibility, sustainability analysis. We can do those market studies you need for that brownfield. You want a grocery store? Will the grocery store work? I mean, really, is there a market for it? What about infrastructure evaluation? We could do those types of services, and we work with our partners, very closely with our partners that have these types of skills that we can bring to the table. That community outreach and input can also involve the visioning, helping you develop architectural renderings. Again, we are now having quite a few, thank you to Kristen Prosaski, quite a few Minnesota communities coming our way. And actually Martha Fost is a big piece of that as well. And it's great because what we do is we kind of help with the softer side. We don't do the phase 1s and phase 2s and cleanup planning. We can review your documents, but we're really there to help build your brownfields program along with you. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, it's free. Next slide. So identifying project partners. I just love this because my granddaughter was in a play about the Addams family, which is really fun. But yeah, we have all sorts of project partners, but we may be able to assist you with, hey, you know, you might consider this partner for this particular project, help bolster your grant applications down the way, help bolster your project. Next slide, please. Community engagement, as I mentioned before, can be very small, it can be very large, it can be community-wide, it can be corridor-wide, however you want to set things up. And that's the way we work it out. Next slide. Strategic redevelopment and redevelopment visioning. I think I mentioned that. Establishing the community revitalization goals. That's an important piece. Next slide. Here are some examples of possible TAB services. All of these are services we have provided. Corridor inventory, market analysis study. The school was community visioning. Solar reuse analysis for an old landfill. This is a partner that's very good at what they do. They are a nonprofit. They're not doing this for profit. It's called the Rocky Mountain Institute. Bringing them on a project is pretty exciting. Vacant buildings, market analysis of possible reuse scenarios. Next slide, please. And then one of the things, this is an area that I typically dabble in the most, is those Brownfields grants and strategy towards applying for a grant. And this is just an example of what was offered last year. This is last year's. This changes every year. We not only help you with strategy, but we also have an e-tool called Tab Easy, kind of walks you through the grant application process. And I can always offer more information for that as we go forward. Next slide. And this is the Tab Easy I mentioned, the e-tools. Another good thing about this is if you're even thinking about, considering an EPA grant, has examples of past successful applications that are provided to us by EPA. It's updated each year. It supports all of the assessment, coalition, cleanup, the multi-purpose revolving loan fund, and even the state and the state's applications for Brownfields grants. Next slide. And not sure to where start with this, just call us, send us an email. And I will say we do a Teams meeting or a call with you to kind of get a feel for the project, but it's pretty simple, pretty informal process. And I'll pass it on to Kristen Lukes.
Thanks, Beth.
Next slide. There we go.
Next slide. There's me passing out all the money. So my name again is Kristen Lukes. I'm with the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. And I've been asked to talk for a few minutes about state and local resources for brownfield investigation and cleanups. So this is going to be a really brief overview. But for more information about some of the programs I'm going to talk about, I would encourage everybody to go to each department's website, watch the YouTube video that I've posted in one of my slides. But the main point is that we have a lot of options and resources available in Minnesota that might not be available in other states. Next slide. So very quickly, I'm going to jump right in with some local resources for investigation, since everybody that spoke before me talked about the investigation processes. So all of the agencies listed here have grants available for phase 1, phase 2, and RAP or cleanup plan development costs. For some of the grants, you can get funds for scattered sites or multiple project areas, but for most of the investigation funding, it's very site specific. Since most of these investigations are also feeders to corresponding cleanup programs, it's often expected that the funded projects will go through all 3 phases of assessment, and the end result will be an MPCA approved response action plan or cleanup plan. Although some of the programs do offer just phase 1 or phase 2 work. Several of these investigation grants, it should be noted, are also capped at $50,000. Next slide. So these same entities offer cleanup grants as well. They're all reimbursement based. So in other words, the work is completed and then invoices are submitted to the grantors for payment. In order to be eligible for any of these cleanup grants, as mentioned earlier, an MPCA approved cleanup plan is required. Aside from the dry cleaner fund, all of the investigation and cleanup grants are competitive. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how each agency scores their applications and how much funding is available from each agency in a little bit. But also keep in mind that some grantors require a match, and the good news is some of the other grantors can actually be the match. Next slide. So lastly, in addition to the cleanup grants that the state offers and investigation grants, there are also loans. In most or all cases, these loans are capitalized through EPA's revolving loan appropriations. So these entities listed on the slide received a grant from EPA to offer loans and sometimes subgrants or forgivable loans to clean up contamination. But since we have so many grant programs in our state, the loans are often the path of last resort. So why apply for a loan? Some projects don't fit nicely or fit into the prioritizations of the grant programs. So that might be an instance where a loan might be a really good choice, or projects that are so large that the granting agencies just can't fund the whole project. So sometimes loans are needed to subsidize the grant money that's already been awarded. Next slide. So basically for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be focusing primarily on deed, Met Council, Hennepin County, and Ramsey County. So the deed grants are statewide. Met Council grants are located in the Twin Cities metro area, and then Hennepin and Ramsey County grants are eligible in those counties specifically. But we do talk about all of these together, and there's reasons for that, and it'll become apparent as I keep going. So who can apply? In most cases, it would be a public entity such as a city, a county, a port authority, a EDA, HRA, but in some cases, it can be a private entity or nonprofit. For those cases where the public entity is the applicant, the public entity does not need to own the property. They just need to apply on behalf of the property owner or the potential purchaser. Next slide. So what do we pay for? So most of the programs have the similar things that they pay for with a few exceptions. Everyone except deed can pay for interior remediation such as asbestos or lead paint abatement in certain situations. I mean, deed can, but through a different program that's outside of today's scope. Deed can also pay for other costs necessary to implement a RAP, such as demolition. So if you have documented contamination under a building and that building needs to be demolished in order to access the soil beneath, to remove the soil beneath the building, then that demo may be an eligible cost. But for the most part, for all these four grantors, we're talking about soil contamination, groundwater contamination, and vapor mitigation. Again, all eligible costs must be part of an approved cleanup plan. Next slide. So there are some things that we don't pay for, shown here, like all the stuff Beth just talked about, all of those activities that are in that planning stage. These grant programs don't pay for those. So if you have those planning activities, again, go to EPA, KSU TAB, or Minnesota Brownfields for assistance. We also don't pay for construction, infrastructure, or other development costs, nor do we pay for removing soil that is not contaminated, but maybe just needs to be removed for geotechnical purposes. Next slide. Okay, so our scoring priorities are listed here. They're very similar, but in some ways different. So for the most part, all agencies are going to look at the site's pre-cleanup and post-cleanup condition. So for deed, we want to see end projects that'll create jobs, increase local tax base, or preferably both. We also look at how dirty the site is and how clean it will be after remediation. And lastly, we look at readiness. You'll see in the next slide that we have grant rounds every 6 months, so projects should apply when they're ready to begin their cleanup and construction and not in those early stages of investigation or pre-investigation timing. Met Council has similar criteria, but also prioritizes affordable housing. And the counties also look at green space, environmental justice, and most of us have geographic priorities or goals. Next slide. So again, just talking about the 4 sources listed, we run our grant rounds at the same time, and that is by design. And so they're always May 1st and November 1st of each year. Between all of us, we have about $8 million per grant cycle, so about $16 million a year. As you can guess, the largest regions have the most money. So for instance, DEED is a statewide program. So we have about half of that, or about 4 million a cycle and 8 million annually. Next slide. So for more information about those 4 programs, we do funding workshops every 6 months. And our latest funding workshop webinar was recorded. So you can find that on the YouTube station there. So lastly, just next slide, a couple of notes. We get asked to whom and for how much we should apply. I would say first, look at your geography to see what funds are available in your area. Next, look at each funder's criteria to see where your project best fits. It doesn't mean you can't apply to more, but just because housing isn't listed as DEED's priority, for example, doesn't mean we don't fund housing projects all the time. So you should apply to as many sources as you can. The funding is by design, again, meant to be stacked. So lastly, when these funds aren't a good fit, or if you want more funding, more autonomy, or whatever your needs are, you also have the option to compete directly for EPA funding, which you're going to hear a lot more about today. So next slide, that's it for me. I'll be sticking around for questions later. I think everything that I said is going to be summarized in one of your handouts as well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carla Acker from the US EPA.
Oops. Thanks, Kristen. I appreciate the introduction. And, you know, before I even get started, I do want to mention one thing I want to mention is that all of the grant programs that Kristen's talked about, except for US EPA's, the revolving loan fund program that's funded by US EPA and the money's given to Minnesota, can be used as match for any of our grants that require a match. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. As Kristen said, I'm with US EPA. I'm a Brownfields project manager. If you receive a US EPA grant, someone like me will be assigned to be your helper and your mentor and help you through the grant process once it's actually awarded. Next slide, please. So when you're thinking about whether, gosh, do I need a US EPA grant, or am I better off working with MPCA and having them help me assess my properties? Some of the things that you want to think about are, how many brownfields do you have that you need to address? If you have a lot of them in your community, then one of our US EPA grants is probably a good way to go. But if you only have 1 or 2 sites that need to be assessed, then you should reach out to MPCA and use their targeted brownfields assessment program. Another thing to think about is, does your organization have the knowledge or the capacity to manage a grant? It takes time and takes a little bit of expertise to be able to, once you get our grants, to do the reporting and the drawdowns and that sort of thing. If you really feel like you don't have that kind of capacity, then really your best bet is to work with MPCA's Targeted Brownfields Assessment Program, or, as I'll talk about later, you might want to form a coalition with a grantee that has more capacity, like a larger community or a land bank or a planning agency. If you do have the capacity, then, you know, by all means, please apply for US EPA grant. Lastly, the thing to consider is what's your time frame on getting the assessment completed or the cleanup completed. If you're on a short time frame and you need the money quickly, then you definitely need to work with your state, work with MPCA or DEED or some of the other programs that Kristen talked about. If you've got more time and you're in the planning stage and you need cleanup a year or so down the road, then the US EPA grants are much, much better. Well, I wouldn't say much, much better, but a US EPA grant is something you might want to consider. Next slide, please. First off, next, I just want to mention that US EPA has a lot of money right now. The bipartisan infrastructure law allocated $1.5 billion for brownfields investment over 5 years. And, we have a focus on getting funds out to new and low capacity communities. And we also are really focusing on community involvement. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about a US EPA grant. Make sure that you are working with your communities and fulfilling some of the goals that they have. And then the other thing that we're focusing on is cleanup funding. In the past, we would give out at the most $200,000 per site. Now we're granting up to $5 million. And that's all funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's going to be 2 more rounds of grant solicitations this coming year and the year after that the bipartisan infrastructure law money will be available. So the time is right. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over our primary grant offerings, the ones that are used the most. I'm going to focus mostly on assessment and cleanup. We do offer multi-purpose grants. I'll talk a little bit about those, and revolving loan fund grants. But I just wanted, so there's going to be things in the slide, more information in my slides than what I'm going to go over, but I wanted you to have the information. So as you can see here, our assessment money right now for FY24, what was offered last year, we were offering up to $500,000 for a single entity and up to $1.5 million if you form a coalition with a more like a more senior or a higher capacity community. And you can also see here our cleanup grant tiers. We offered 3 tiers of cleanup grants. Multi-purpose grants, we're not sure we're going to offer those this next coming round. That would be FY25 because we offered them this last year. And then the revolving loan fund grants, they will likely be offered this coming year because we usually flip-flop. 1 year we'll offer multi-purpose grants, and then the following year we'll offer revolving loan fund grants. Next slide, please. So let's get into a little more detail on each of the grants. Our assessment grants are offered in 2 flavors. One is a community-wide assessment grant, and that would be when a single community or a single entity would request assessment funding that they will spend within their own geographic boundary. As you can see, we typically offer up to $500,000 per award. That was in FY24, and these numbers could change. You have 4 years to spend your money. And last year, just to give you kind of a sense of how much money we give out, last year we offered $30 million. So we gave 60 grants out. And we split those grants between new entities, new grantees, and former grantees. Because one of the things we want to do, as I mentioned earlier, is get money out to new and to smaller and lower capacity communities. Next slide, please. In your community-wide assessment grant, you must identify a target area, and you can only spend up to $200,000 per site. But you can spend, but you will get a lot more money than that. $200,000 for an assessment is quite a bit, so you should be able to do what you need to do. The money can be used for assessments, planning, and community engagement. That's some of the stuff that Beth can offer as well. And you must procure an environmental consultant to conduct the assessments. I'll touch on that a little bit, but Beth is going to talk about procurement of your contractor in her slides coming up soon. Next slide, please. In addition to, back one, please. In addition to the, you're going forward. keep going backwards. One more. There we go. In addition to the community-wide assessment grants where you have just one entity, you can also form a coalition. And as I said, the idea of the coalition grants is to have one higher capacity entity run the grant and then partner with 2 to 4 other lower capacity communities or nonprofits to and the reason that we do that is to try to get the money out to these lower capacity communities and let the lead coalition member basically teach them and bring them along in the process. Last year, we offered $40 million and we gave out 26 awards. That was more than a 50% increase from the year before. I anticipate that this year we're going to do something similar. So, you know, when you're deciding, am I better off going for a coalition grant or a community-wide assessment grant, you think long and hard. If you have a good coalition of a group of partners that you would like to work with, and you have a lead coalition member, next slide, please. So talk about the lead coalition members, and have a lead coalition member that's willing to work with you, your best bet might be the coalition assessment grant, because we're offering more money for coalition assessment grants than community-wide. Now, one thing you need to point out is the lead member needs to be either a state, a county, a tribe, a regional council, or a group of general purpose units of government. And if you have land banks in Minnesota that are active, land banks can also be a lead member. Non-lead members cannot have had an assessment, cleanup, multi-purpose, or revolving loan fund grant that has recently closed. In 2024, which is the last round of grant solicitations, you couldn't have had a grant that had closed in 2015 or later. So if you had applied a long time ago, back when we were a pilot program, you'd still be eligible to be a non-lead member. Next slide, please. We strongly encourage you to, if you're going to form a coalition, include a nonprofit. And the reason that we encourage you to include a nonprofit as a non-lead member is so that we can show and help have strong community involvement. It's not a requirement. If you can demonstrate that you have strong community involvement, even without the inclusion of a nonprofit entity as a non-coalition, non-lead member, that's okay. But just keep that in mind. We're kind of looking for that community involvement. And then there's some details here on the geographic areas and how many sites need to be assessed in each area. Next slide, please. Let's talk about cleanup grants now. In the past, you know, as I mentioned, we did not have very much cleanup money at all. And, you know, before the infrastructure law, our cleanup grants were capped at $200,000 per site. As you all know, you can't get a lot done with $200,000 unless maybe you're working on a gas station or some very small site. Last year, we offered 3 tiers of cleanup funding, up to $500,000. Those grantees, those proposals were reviewed in one chunk. $500,000 to $1 million, those grant applications were evaluated as a separate chunk and just competed against each other. And then also 1 million to 5 million. The year before, FY22, our grants were offered, the highest tier was $1 million to $2 million. As you can see, last year we were putting even more emphasis on cleanup grants, and we upped the ceiling to $5 million. I cannot tell you what it's going to be this year, whether the headquarters will knock it back to 2 million or whether we're going to go once again up to 5 million. There's no cost share. Normally, our regular non-bill money, non-Brownfields infrastructure, or I'm sorry, bipartisan infrastructure law funding requires a 20% cost share. The bill money, there's no cost share required. We have a 4-year project period, and then there's some statistics down there about, you know, how many awards we gave in each, or that we were offering in each of the 3 tiers this last year. Next slide, please. Couple things you need to keep in mind. If you're going to apply for a cleanup grant, the applicant must own the site by the time that you send in your proposal, your application for funding. Last year and most years, the applications for funding are due in November or December. The proposal guidelines come out in September, and then we give between 45 and 60 days for the applications to be written and submitted through grants.gov. You have to make sure that you are not a responsible party as defined by CERCLA, which means you must have done all appropriate inquiry. That means you need to have done a phase 1 assessment within 1 year prior, prior to taking title to the property. And if the phase 1 assessment is more than 6 months old, it needs to be updated within 6 months, 180 days prior to taking title. In sites last year, and this could change for next year, if you have a site that received, say, a $200,000 cleanup grant pre-bill, then those sites were not eligible for Brownfields cleanup, for a Brownfields cleanup grant last year in FY24. That could change in FY25. Just so if you have a site that's already had some cleanup money, Brownfields cleanup grant applied to it, look closely at this year's coming guidelines to see if you can apply for additional funding if that site needs additional cleanup. Another thing that you need to keep in mind and think ahead on is the site has to be fully assessed. In the past, there were times when we would give grantees cleanup money and they didn't even really know the extent of contamination, and they really couldn't come up with a good cleanup estimate because they didn't have the contamination fully delineated. And they would, in their proposal, their grant proposal, it sounded like they had their contamination fully delineated, but they may not have. So 2 years ago, we started asking the states to write a letter to say whether sites have been fully delineated. So work with MPCA on site characterization. Now, if you're thinking about coming in for a cleanup grant, now's the time you might want to talk to MPCA about maybe in case you need some additional sampling. Next slide, please. The multi-purpose grants, I'll go over those very quickly because I really don't think they're going to be offered this year. We offered them last year, but those are kind of a combination of cleanup grants and assessment grants all in one. And it has a longer project period, a 5-year project period, and we offer up to $1 million per award. These will very likely be offered in FY26, and that will be the last year that bill money will be available for the multi-purpose grants. So if you think that this is the kind of grant that you're interested in, talk to MPCA, call myself up or Carrie Cragen. She works in Minnesota quite a bit. Call us up and talk about your projects and whether a multi-purpose grant might be good for you, because not FY25, but FY26 is probably going to be the last time that these grants are a little bit less competitive because we have more money. Next slide, please. There's just some more information on the multi-purpose grants. For the sake of time, I'll let you read through those. But the requirements, the one thing I do want to point out is the requirements for the multi-purpose grants the bar's pretty low. You just have to make sure that you complete one phase 2 assessment and one cleanup. And in contrast to the cleanup grants, you can clean up with a multi-purpose grant. You can clean up a site that had previously received US EPA cleanup grant money. And you have to come up with one revitalization plan for the target area, or you can do that for the site. If one already exists, you just need to say that in your application, and then you may not have to come up with a revitalization plan for the target area. Next slide, please. For more information, I just have some things listed here about the Minnesota Brownfields Grant Writing Workshop that TAB will be helping Minnesota Brownfields on the week of August 20th. And I have my contact information up there, as well as Carrie Cragen, who, once again, she's another person just like me who does a lot of work in Minnesota. Next slide, please. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand this over to Beth.
Thank you, Carla. As always, a lot of good information. I just wanted to start off this particular session with the way that we're presenting this one. This is kind of the brainchild of Carla and of course myself and some folks at Ohio about the attributes of a successful community versus maybe those that just struggle and keep struggling and can't seem to push the envelope. So we will have throughout this presentation comments and tips and maybe even strategy provided by our expert panel, which includes Kristen Lukes, Carla Acker, and Courtney. Oh my gosh, Courtney, I'm fading on here.
Kremlinger.
Thank you. From Mankato, who has been there and done that. And she'll have a presentation here later. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Kristen, and we'll get this going.
Great. Thanks, Beth. Next slide, please. So as Beth mentioned, this part of the presentation really is just looking at the capabilities needed, and specifically, like if you don't feel confident in one area, resources that you could use to increase capacity. Next slide. All right, so we'll cover outreach planning, including like the inventory, the financial management capacity, and then the technical and procurement side of things. Next slide. All right, so from outreach and planning, these are really important pieces in order to be able to advance, to compete for EPA grant funds and to just overall advance brownfield redevelopment projects. So some questions you might want to think through are, do you have an ability and capacity to engage citizens or stakeholders to gain their feedback? It could be through meetings or open house or surveys. The second thing would be, do you have partners already, or your team, or do you still need to do some outreach to try to make that be successful? Maybe it's a local chamber of commerce or development group or local nonprofits. The third thing is, have you already identified brownfield sites? Did you start an inventory, or do you have a targeted area, just so that you kind of know where are you focusing your efforts? And then do you have an ability to do a project that aligns with existing city plans? Because that will be really, really important, especially as things come to fruition. So if you think through all those and say, yeah, then you're really in a good position to move forward and consider some of the other items we'll talk about. If not, if some of those are like, well, no, we don't really have all of that, we'll try to talk through resources or ways that you can move that forward. Next slide, please. So with outreach capacity, I think, one really key part is identifying who's going to lead the brownfield effort. And there will be a lot of people involved. So it isn't like, it's a one-person show, but it's helpful to know who's going to kind of champion the effort. So that would be a suggestion to start out with. The outreach can start in ways that maybe you're very familiar with. Maybe you already use social media to communicate with the community, or you have newsletters or other ways of communicating. Those are really good ways to communicate about brownfields as well. It will be important to get feedback and input. So it would be maybe a matter of having some kind of a workshop or a pop-up event or charrette to gain those, to engage the community around brownfields. And for that piece of it, you do really want to make sure that your outreach is getting to everyone in the community. Just offering a variety of ways, or just making sure that, again, it's hitting all groups within the community, because sometimes we have a tendency to see, you know, the usual suspects, or to hear from sometimes the same people. And it isn't that we don't want to hear from them, but we want to make sure we're hearing other voices as well. With partners, again, you want to really be reaching out, because it's going to take a group effort to move things forward. And I was going to ask Courtney, can you share some insights about engagement?
Yeah. And so in Mankato, when we were applying for our EPA Brownfield Assessment Grant, we went to a business association that was within one of our targeted redevelopment areas. We also went to neighborhood associations that were located along our targeted areas for redevelopment. We went to Minnesota State University, Mankato. They have a water resources center, and also their geography department. They have professors that teach courses about brownfields and have knowledge too in the Mankato area on specific sites. We went to them. We went to nonprofits, and these are all opportunities as well to talk about brownfields. And if for like our neighborhood associations and the business association, they didn't always know what a brownfield was, so that's a good opportunity as well, and to explain what the benefits are if in investigating those sites. So that's been helpful for us as well. And some of them too went on to sit on our Brownfield Advisory Committee as part of our assessment grant.
Oh, that's great, Courtney. It's fantastic that you reached out to so many different stakeholders and had them included up front. So thank you. I do want to say that, KSU can help with the outreach piece of things. So if it's a matter of, needing to have workshops or just help bring education or discussion around brownfields, we can definitely help with that. And sometimes we do that in partnership with the MPCA, which has been really great as well. Next slide. So KSU really does specialize in that outreach or gaining input, and specifically in rural, tribal, or disadvantaged communities. And sometimes, depending on the project, it could involve partnerships with other agencies as well, other state or federal agencies, potentially the health department, or, working in partnership with where maybe funding would be coming through USDA or HUD's CDBG program, and just kind of pairing those. So KSU can help find those areas where it might make sense to bring in partners, and then assist with the outreach as well. Next slide, please. So strategic planning, the planning is really key to success. The outreach and input, economic feasibility, and market studies can be important components that would feed into the plan or help support the plan. It brings about the redevelopment goals that you and partners would collectively be working on together. And that often would include stakeholder meetings that can be really critical to making sure you have input and that the product is something that is, that everybody's collectively behind that. Courtney, did you have insight into strategic planning that you could share with us as well?
Yeah, and that's something that's been huge for Mankato. We've had several different planning initiatives, mainly in our downtown area where we have a lot of brownfield sites, and those planning initiatives have included redevelopment goals as well. And the engagement is so important. Like we do it at all stages of our planning initiative. So at the beginning, throughout the plan development, and at the end. So you're not making a plan and then taking it to the public for comment. They have that opportunity to help shape it. And by doing it that way too, it helps to have more community support and buy-in for those plans. And that can be helpful because then it can show the council that there's community support. So that might be helpful if you're looking for financial assistance to help with redevelopment. So if it's in Mankato, it led to creating new loan programs in our downtown for rehab, and also can be used for redevelopment, and can also lead to supporting requests for tax increment financing or TIF. So it's been something really important in Mankato that there's different planning efforts that had started in the 70s and just evolved with different goals, and it's been successful here, I would say.
Fantastic. Thanks, Courtney. Next slide, please. So with the inventory and targeted area, you would want to get started with that and really just know that an inventory can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. It literally could just be a list or a spreadsheet where you're able to add property information. And having an inventory started doesn't mean you know everything about the sites listed there. It just starts out as a list of, these are sites that are a brownfield. We know there's an issue, or we think there's a potential for it, and it has redevelopment potential, or it's a property that we're interested in looking at. And you can, keep it simple, or have a lot of information as you learn it. It's more of a working document. You can add as you go and modify as you go. And you would again use input from the community. So Courtney talked about many outreach efforts that occurred in Mankato, and community members will know a lot. I mean, they'll know a lot of site history, and so they're a great resource. Again, planning documents, windshield and walking surveys. But again, it's a working document. So Courtney, can you add further insight?
Yeah, and what I was talking about earlier to our Brownfield Advisory Committee, they've helped us prioritize and also identify sites, and so that also included other city staff and county staff and environmental resources. I don't think I mentioned those earlier, but having those neighborhood associations, business associations, and community members sit on there has been helpful, and meeting if it's a couple times a year to check in and see if anything's new, or to review those lists has been helpful.
Perfect. Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, the prioritization. Can you go to the next slide, please? The prioritization can be really an important piece, because sometimes the list can be extensive, and it's like, oh, what do we do with this now? So trying to prioritize, and you get to choose the priority to say, we really maybe you want to focus on a certain area or corridor, or maybe it's sites that are highly visible within the community, or more ready to go than others. Maybe a business wants to expand, and there's opportunity there. So there's just many different ways you can choose to prioritize. Next slide. So the reuse visioning, again, it's just such an important piece. And I do want to say, so TAB can assist with the visioning process. And TAB services, as Beth talked about, it covers a number of items, and there really are community or site specific. So it's not a matter of this is what we do every time on within every community. It's looking at, is it a market analysis that would be really useful in advancing the project, or a revitalization plan, or analyzing if renewables are a possibility on the site. So please know that you can reach out to KSU. And Carla, I wanted to check in with you if you had further thoughts on the reuse visioning process.
Sorry about that. That took me a minute. I just want to reiterate everything that you've talked about, that the reuse, you need to have the community involved from the very, very beginning, and work with them. If you're already working with US EPA and are like a former grantee, you should talk to your project manager from US EPA, because there is some technical assistance for site reuse visioning that we can offer, but those are only for projects that have already been that US EPA is already active in their community. That's all.
Great, thanks, Carla. Next slide, please. So with visioning services, you know, things can start with general ideas, and the vision can just be further refined through additional community engagement and kind of gathering that input to get it to be a little bit more specific within the vision. And that allows you to know that you're moving forward with a community supported project. And Courtney laid out a great, you know, kind of that great pathway forward of it makes it easier for approvals if it's for local incentives or just other approvals needed from a city council or an EDA. It also makes it easier when that vision is there it makes it an easier decision for developers because they can see if their project aligns with the vision. They'll know that there's community support for it, that they're not going to run into last minute issues with a lot of pushback because it often would be a change in use. And it makes it easier for, you know, for someone as a staff person to talk confidently about what the community supports and wants to see, and has council backing. And so it just makes it that much easier as well to provide clarity to interested developers or buyers. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn things over to Beth.
Well, thank you, Kristen. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, let's talk about financial management, why it's important. It's important to have you already managed and complied with other state and federal programs. That's an important piece because you could be overwhelmed if you're thinking an EPA Brownfields grant, and there are ways to get that kind of assistance. And does your organization have in-house experience to draw upon? And so if you have that, great. But if you don't, let's go to the next slide, please. How do you build the capacity? Well, it varies by grant type. And so what we always recommend is that you really go the path of least resistance. Go with maybe those types of programs that don't require the financial management, like MPCA and EPA. They already have their contractors. And DEED and most EPA Brown programs do involve management of funding and require financial capability. I believe Kristen has a comment on that. Kristen?
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to say, yes, for DEED and a lot of the grants that we talked about, we always say, you know, grants aren't free money, you know, there's a cost to that. And, you know, a lot of times our grants that go to public entities or local units of government, they're kind of pass-through dollars. So in a lot of the non-financial grant management kind of oftentimes happens at the consultant level, but the cities still need to manage the funds and still need to be in charge of collecting invoices and have the capacity to do any reporting requirements or any of those things that are required.
Thank you. And this is your project. So you should know what's going on. Audits happen. Audits happen. Next slide, please. You can also look at partnering with others that have that capability, like a regional entity, economic development districts, regional planning commissions. So that's a way where a smaller community can be part of a larger effort. And we may be able to provide you with contacts from communities in your area that have done that, and maybe try to figure out would that work with them. Kristen, you have a comment?
Sure. Just echo what Beth just said. Also in Minnesota, you can work with your local economic development commissions. Your initiative foundations are good resources. Any anybody who's gotten a small cities grant or any HUD financing, a lot of the requirements are exactly the same federal requirements. So you may have experience that you didn't even realize that you had because you work with some other state and federal grants as well.
All right. Next slide, please. And so there are additional resources for EPA grants. Just check out this website and kind of get an idea of what we're talking about. And there are trainings if you are going after an EPA Brownfields grant. They will help you. And yes, you can have a consultant maybe helping you with some of this, but when it comes to drawing down funds, the financial piece, not so much. So next slide, please. And then we get to technical and contractor management capacity. Wow, this is one that I really find it can make or break your project. And what can break your project is that you are not involved. You drive the car, they're in the back seat, but they provide a valuable experience about getting you to where you want to go. But do you have the technical ability to prepare an RFP or an RFPQ for a qualified consultant? Do you have the resources to work with your state or federal project manager? The issue with that is having the resources, especially if you're thinking about an EPA Brownfields grant, there's a lot of time involved with this. A lot of people walk into this and they don't realize this is going to take time. It isn't just about passing it over to a consultant to do all the work. So you have to, these are things that maybe if you are applying for an EPA Brownfields grant, you might consider putting up to a certain limit, of course, within grant guidelines, maybe program management funds, or actually there's no limit on that piece. It's when you get more into the overhead type of costs, there's a limit there. But you need to put funding in there for yourself. And I do have a comment here from Carla.
Yeah, yes, I'd just like to add that and really reiterate what Beth said. Your contractor, you're in the driver's seat. Your contractor is there to help educate you. I don't want all the things that we're talking about as far as it takes time to run an EPA grant and you have to kind of know what you're doing. I don't want any of that to discourage you. And Beth doesn't either. I'm not saying that Beth's trying to discourage you, but just realize that one of the things you need to be able to get along with your contractor. You need to be able to have a relationship with them, with your environmental consultant. Make sure when you're interviewing them, say, hey, look, I've got limited capacity. I've got limited knowledge about this whole brownfields thing. It's like, I know redevelopment, but I don't necessarily know how to I don't know about brownfields. What resources can you bring to me? How are you going to be able to help me understand what you're talking about? So just make sure that you're able to have a relationship there. That's all.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Next slide, please. And then procurement requirements depend on the individual grant program. MPCA, targeted brownfield assessment. This is easy peasy. You go in, you fill out the application. They've already gone through the procurement process as well as EPA targeted brownfield assessments. And the EPA targeted brownfield assessments are great to go after if MPCA doesn't really have the funds. Maybe they're out for a few months. They're at capacity. And then, but the deed cleanup and investigation grants, they do require that. So I'll let Kristen Luke speak to that. Or not. Maybe we'll go to the next slide. This is a slide that is really important. Again, as Carla mentioned, I can I can kind of act like your mother, I think, sometimes. It sounds like I'm discouraging people, but I'm not really. I want them to know what they're out in for. But the competitive procurement is required for EPA Brownfields grant. I'll just let you run with this one, Carla.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. Yeah, you have to follow federal procurement regulations if you have a US EPA grant. Now, typically, just so you know, most states have, and communities even, have more stringent procurement regulations than US EPA. So don't be afraid of our procurement regulations, but just be aware of them. So to make sure that you meet both your procurement regulations for your city or state requires, as well as US EPA. We have lots of guidance out there on federal procurement. So this document that Beth has up is a fact sheet that we put out regarding procurement. And Beth, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's on the resources page.
Yes.
To which there's a link to either in these slides or in somewhere around here, you'll be getting that. And then we also have something called Best Practices Guide for Federal Procurement. And Beth also is going to post that. But regarding this fact sheet that Beth has a little picture of, there's a couple of things that I want to point out to you that to make sure that you don't, they could be a mild stumbling block if you're not aware. The first thing is oftentimes grantees or people who are applying for our grants, a consultant will come to them and say, hey, I can help you get that grant. And that's great. And sometimes they'll write the grant application or they'll work with you as you're writing your grant application. And so then you get the grant and you're like, well, great. This lovely consultant here is going to help me write my request for qualifications or request for proposals. You can't do that. You can do that. Well, let me say that. You can do that. But that grantee or that consultant is not allowed to bid on the request for proposals that they helped write. So, keep that in mind. If you've got a consultant that you've been working with and you'd like them to at least have a chance of following the federal procurement regulations and you hiring them, don't let them write your request for proposals. Also, don't write your request. Make sure that you don't have language in your request for proposals that's too restrictive. We want, and this is a big deal for EPA, we want contractors who have not necessarily managed brownfields grants to have an option of being able to show their stuff and show that they can help communities with assessments. So you can't write your proposal so restrictive that it restricts it down, number one, to a particular consultant that maybe helped you with your grant application, or to consultants that you can't put in your procurement request for proposals that the consultant has managed US EPA brownfields assessment or cleanup grants. You can get to those same endpoints. You can't use those words. Price has to be considered. You don't have to pick the lowest price bidder or contractor, but you have to consider price. We recommend that 25% of the scoring for choosing the contractor be price. But if you want to choose a contractor who's not the lowest bid, just make sure you document why you chose them. It's okay. You don't have to feel like you're, being criticized for not picking the lowest. You just have to say why they were the lowest and best. You need to make sure that you use full open competition. You need to advertise your request for proposals widely. I can't speak for Ohio. Like in Ohio, we have certified professionals that are actually certified by Ohio EPA. And so for them, in Ohio, it's really easy. As long as the request for proposals goes to all the certified professionals in the state, then they're covered. In other states, if there's professional organizations, that's a good place to post these things. Post requests for proposals, newspapers, all your typical stuff there. And one last thing, We recommend, and there's a good reason for this, we recommend that you include options for extending the contract. So say, for instance, you get an assessment grant that's a 4-year assessment grant. Make sure that in your contract, you have the ability to extend that contract past 4 years, because you may not spend all your money in 4 years. You may have some reason why you have to request an extension. And if you don't have that clause in your contract, you're going to have to go out and rebid to get a contractor for that additional year. Or you may have an assessment grant that you've got most of your money spent down on, and then you apply for another assessment grant. And if you want to keep your same contractor on board, if you have those options in there, then you can continue on with the same contractor. Okay, I think I've taken enough time, but I'm open for questions later if you have them.
That's great. Thank you. Next slide, please. And then solving the vicious circle. I think this entire team that's been speaking today can really support you, but along with the other advocacy organizations, the regional entities, these are all things. KSU TAB can provide scope assistance. We can also assist you with developing an RFPQ that it should be in compliance with the EPA procurement guidelines. Next slide, please. And gaining experience, just make time to
Excuse
learn.
me.
Oh,
Can I interject here? I see a question in the chat or a comment in
yes,
the chat
please.
that I didn't think it would be an issue here, but if you're a state and I think a tribe, if Rosita Clark helped me out with this because I don't deal with tribes, but if you're a state and I think a tribe, you don't have to follow the federal procurement regulations. You can follow your own procurement regulations. So I just wanted to make that clear. I see a question that kind of makes me think there's people in the audience I might have confused.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Rosita, are you on? Is that
Rosita?
true for tribes? She may not. I know she was going to try to attend.
I know she was. I have heard that from another place too, so.
Okay, so stay
And
safe.
Brian, we can all get together with Rosita, but I'm pretty sure Carla's steering you right. So best approaches to gaining experience. I've got some good ideas there. Taking an OSHA training course. That's actually really a good idea. Just to kind of have a feel for what you're getting, just to have some background knowledge. Next slide, please. And then best approaches to gaining experience to oversee, manage your contractor consultant. Okay, so that's how I learned way back in the day. I asked our poor consultant a lot of questions. In fact, I think he named a monitoring well after me because I was asking him why wasn't where I thought it should be, but didn't have to be. But anyway, what I'm saying is oversee their work, show up for meetings where your projects are being discussed. And I've got hopefully just a couple short comments here. Carla, do you have any comments on that?
I'm sorry, Beth. I was answering Brian's question. Best approaches for, I wasn't paying attention. My bad. Best approaches for gaining experience to oversee and manage your contractor. Oh, you know what? Just the only thing I wanted to say about this slide is to reiterate what I said earlier. You have hired your contractor, ask questions, help make them educate you make sure that you can have a good relationship with them. That was all. Thank you.
And I think one of the points you did bring up was they should be ready to answer questions and to actually teach you as you go, because really it builds their business. It builds your capacity to find what's going on in the project and what needs to be done.
Yep, absolutely. And I will say that in my experience over 20 years in Brownfield, I've never run across a grantee where the environmental contractor is not happy to help them. So I don't want you guys to think that it's a common experience to have your contractor kind of keep the information so he feels superior or something. That in my experience has not been the case, but I just want you to know that your contractor is your partner, but you still have to watch them because contractors are contractors.
What's your project? Yeah,
Pardon me?
it's
Pardon
your
me?
project.
Absolutely. So thank you.
Courtney, did you have anything?
Yeah, and just to say, like when I started working on projects that had grants for brownfields, it was all like completely new to me. Like I didn't know what a phase 1 or a phase 2 or what was a RAP, what's that stand for, and like what's the sequence of those reports. I didn't really know anything, but asking those questions is really helpful. And even sitting in on meetings, like if there's a call about a site with, like I've sat on ones with the MPCA, and sometimes it's so technical, I have no idea really what they're talking about, but I have a basic understanding of the process. But just being exposed to those types of conversations too, you learn a lot over time. And um even to say with the like deed cleanup grants, there's like parts on that will ask for some technical information regarding the contamination. What's worked well for me is I'll just highlight the parts of the application that I need from the developer or their consultant and send it to them, and then their consultant will complete those parts of the application for me. But
All right, well, we'll go on to the next slide here. And acres, who was it that had a comment on acres?
I had one on this one just to
Okay.
say, like, we have a consultant for our EPA grant, and they help us with the reporting in acres, so you can have them. That's been really helpful to have our consultant help with the reporting too.
Yeah, especially that technical part, right? Identifying contaminants, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Carla?
Yes, and you know what? That's perfectly acceptable to have your contractor enter information into acres, but make sure you review that information because you are ultimately the person responsible for making sure that the acres submittals are correct.
Thank you. Next slide, please. And so if you think you're filling in the buckets or you've got a plan for filling the buckets, let's go for it. If you want to go for an EPA Brownfields grant, there's going to be a workshop in St. Cloud, August 20th. Elizabeth Klusner has all sorts of details about it, and you'll register through Minnesota Brownfields. So we'll save the dates later in the spring, but we hope you can be there. Next slide, please. Oh, and this is just, hey, take a look at last year's guidelines. Check out the facts. See the closed solicitations for resource materials. Go to www.ksutab.org and look at Tab Easy. Next. Oh, Carla?
I am sorry to keep interjecting, but just one other thing I wanted to mention is until the request for US EPA's request for proposals comes out in September, we project managers like myself, like Carrie, some of you guys may know Ashley Green, Rosita, we are allowed to speak frankly with you and talk to you and strategize with you about what kind of grant would be a good grant for you and what kinds of things you need to consider and give you tips on, how to write a competitive grant. Once those proposal guidelines come out, we are mum. Only thing we can talk to you guys about because of the competition, because it is a competition, is threshold review criterion. Is the site eligible? Are you an eligible entity? But I encourage you to reach out to US EPA and ask us questions and bring your projects to us. And we would be more than happy, all of us, to talk to you and help you strategize and make sure that you're a good fit for our grants and give you some tips.
And especially those cleanup grants. If you're thinking about going after a cleanup grant now, I think it's best to make sure that you're eligible. And it's always good to run that project by EPA folks like Carrie and Carla.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And the eligibility stuff, like I said, we can even talk to you about that after the proposal guidelines come out. But you can talk to us prior to that about community engagement. You can talk to us about, do you think this site would be competitive? I don't have a redevelopment plan for this site. Is it still going to be competitive? What can I do to make it more competitive? What kinds of things have you being us seen that kind of sets a grant apart from another one or a similar project to mine? Yes, use this. It's actually one of the best parts of our job, is to be able to help communities one-on-one like that.
I love hearing that. That's great. All right, so next slide. And not sure where to start. I think it's very easy. Just give us a ring or email us. And I'm going to pass this on to Courtney. And Courtney, I have to warn you a little ahead of time. We're running a bit short of
Yeah.
time.
Okay.
But and I'm sorry,
That's
but
okay.
we appreciate everything you offer. So let's go.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. So Courtney Cramlinger, I work for the City of Mankato in our Community Development Department, and we've received 2 EPA Brownfield assessment grants, each one in the amount of $300,000, and they've been multi-year grants, so they've had a 3-year project period. And we're in our last year of our second award right now. Next slide, please. So these are some of the activities that we funded with our assessment grants. So phase 1, phase 2's RAPs, building material surveys, and also for reuse planning. Next slide. This is a map of part of Mankato. The stars represent where the locations of where we've used our assessment grant. The red stars are for sites that I'm going to be talking about in my presentation. Next slide. So one of the sites is a former automotive maintenance facility where they had an underground storage tank that was removed. One of those sites where you look at it and you think there's probably something there that maybe needs to happen if it's going to be reused. The automotive business had closed, and so we used our EPA grant to do the phase 1 and phase 2. It was ultimately found there wasn't any cleanup or remediation that needed to happen, but by doing that investigation, it led to that property sale and then the reuse of the building as a brewery. And it's kind of cool if you see in the picture. You can see they left where those overhead doors were for the cars, and when it's a nice day out, they'll open those up and let the fresh air in. So it's kind of cool to see that remnant of the previous use. Next slide, please. Other site is called Studio 5. So this is in our Old Town neighborhood in our downtown. And there was a former dry cleaner that began operating, I believe it was in the 1960s, and then the property fell to foreclosure and they abandoned the property. They did the dry cleaning in the building and left the dry cleaner equipment in there. Initially, we did receive a deed investigation grant. And after that, the redevelopment plans grew, the site boundaries increased, they added more parcels to it. So then on those parcels we added in, we used our assessment grant to do the phase 1 and phase 2, along with the hazardous materials survey in the building, and then the RAP. It led to the redevelopment of a 3-story mixed-use building where there's 19 studio apartments, and then there's 2 commercial suites on the ground floor. And through this presentation, I'll be mentioning 2 other tools that we used for these projects. So we also had a deed cleanup grant for this project, and we used tax increment financing as well. Next slide, please. This is a project that's currently under construction. Silo site, we used our assessment grant for the phase 1 and phase 2. We didn't have enough funds to do the RAP, so that was financed privately by the developer. But then we also leveraged this redevelopment with TIF and then a low interest loan from the city. So it'll be a 4-story mixed use building. There's a commercial tenant suite on the ground floor. There'll be enclosed parking, and then there's 26 apartments up above. And this site, you can see in the bottom left, that's a picture of the buildings that used to be there. Not very pretty to look at. No, it was a warehouse, and they had torn those buildings down in connection with the redevelopment across the street. They planned for it to be a parking lot and found they didn't need the parking. And so then they put together these redevelopment plans, just kind of showing how there can be a kind of a shift in what the plans are over the years. Next slide, please. And one of the unique things with the assessment grants is you can also use it for reuse planning. And we use that to prepare 2 different plans. The first one I'm going to talk about is our Riverside North area-wide plan. And that's for one of the major corridors into Mankato at the intersection of US Highway 169 and Highway 14. There were several vacant properties and underutilized commercial and industrial sites, a lot of large parcels with small buildings and lots of pavement, not kind of an area that we wanted to target for redevelopment, to kind of improve those, first impressions when you're coming into Mankato. I have the table of contents in here to give you an idea of the different types of things that we included in the plan. So they look at, the existing conditions. In this one, we looked to their MnDOT's planning to remove a signalized intersection in this corridor. And so this plan also helped with changing some of the road networks adjacent to the highway. It included a market study to see what types of uses might be viable if after redevelopment, and it also gave some different scenarios and redevelopment concepts. Next slide, please. So this shows the planning area for that. There was 3 focus sites in the plan. The one at the top of the map, focus site number 1, I think it's like a 15-acre parcel. We did use our EPA grant to do a phase 1 and phase 2 on that site as well. Then our second focus site is actually under redevelopment right now. In that one, they gave some different scenarios too for redevelopment under this plan. And then we received a deed investigation grant for that property, the Access project, and then also a redevelopment grant, and then tax increment financing as well. And with this plan, there was public engagement with the property owners and business owners. We started this in 2020, so it was kind of at that point adapting to learning Zoom and doing our public engagement that way. But we still had a good turnout for engaging with those property owners and the businesses in that area, and then the public in general as well. Next slide, please. So yeah, having those redevelopment scenarios is just really helpful tool to show what's possible. So this is that first focus site, just to show different possibilities for how that could be positioned. Next slide, please. So then we also had our Jefferson Quarry redevelopment plan. And this one, it was a quarry that began mining activities in the 1850s. It's a 54-acre site, so this one was a little bit different, and we were working with, it involved one property owner, where the other plan, it was a larger area with several property owners. So it had a little bit of a different approach, but next slide, please. So yeah, we worked more, like a lot heavier with the private property owner through this process, lots of meetings with the property owner, and then also with the neighborhood. We did engagement with just the neighborhood first before we opened it up to the community at large. But meeting them in their neighborhood, that was helpful to hear from them for what they would like to see. It was a neighborhood that has a higher population of low to moderate income households, and they're near the river and a trail that we have along the river, but they've been cut off by this quarry. So it was a nice opportunity to talk with them too about different opportunities for connections to the trail and also to the river. This one included the market study as well and different development concepts. Next slide, please. So these are some of the concepts in the plan, showing different types of residential, mixed use, and different land uses in that area. And with this one, there was only one access point to the site. It was this north one. But then you can see it was an opportunity as well. The thing that we heard from the neighborhood was it was really important for them to have a new access to the south. There's a smaller part of the neighborhood it has like a dead end into it, and to get to those homes, there's a railroad track you have to cross, and the railroad will frequently stop there and you can't get in or out, so it's kind of a safety concern as well. So having this redevelopment would have that opportunity to provide that second access point for that neighborhood, so they have another option to get in and out of their neighborhood. Next slide, please. So one that we're investigating right now with our assessment grant is a future expansion of the Children's Museum of Southern Minnesota. So we did the phase 1, we're finishing up the phase 2, and then we'll be preparing the wrap for that. And the site is it's owned by the city, and we have a long-term lease with the museum. There was one parcel that was privately owned that completed that block, and they purchased that, so now it'll be nice to have the museum on that whole block. Historically, it was an unpermitted dump, and then after that, it was the city's former mass transit garage. So they reused that building, but now they're planning to add on to that building. So that's one of our projects we're working on right now. Next slide, please. And this one didn't use EPA grant funds, but I just wanted to show another example of different tools that it can take for redevelopment projects. This one was a 4-acre site. It was used by the state, and then more recently it was the city's former public works facility garage. You can see our EDA, they authorized an RFP for the redevelopment of the site back in 2017, and construction on that first phase didn't begin until 2020. It can take sometimes a long time for these redevelopment projects, but they can have such a huge impact. I just love seeing the transformation of the sites. It's cool to see what they can become. And with this one too, there was a lot of public engagement with the neighborhood, and an advantage too that was that since we owned the property, we had more say in what the reuse could be. We had in our RFP, it was specified that it was needed to meet an identified community need, and that there was a priority for affordable housing with that redevelopment. Next slide, please. And so it got split up into 2 different phases. The first phase, Sinclair Flats, that's finished, that opened last fall. It has 38 units of income restricted apartment units, and then 10 units of market rate. Lewis Lofts is the second phase, which is under construction, and that'll be 64 units of affordable senior housing. So those projects use the low-income housing tax credits. We use TIF, some of our American Rescue Plan or ARP funds. We had the deed investigation grant, and then a cleanup grant for each of those phases. Next slide. Okay, and so it's kind of getting ready, and what kind of led to the city to going after the EPA grant. We had, like I talked about earlier, several different city-led planning initiatives that identified redevelopment opportunities. We had different programs created for redevelopment and rehab, and we had success with deed grants, and having that experience with those types of grants that positioned us well for an EPA grant. Next slide, please. So some of the things that's been helpful by having an EPA grant is it can provide those efficiencies by being able to do several sites under one grant. You're not having to apply for a grant for each specific site. So when you're applying for the grant, you'll have to identify different brownfield sites that exist in your community, and doesn't mean you have to investigate only those. So in our applications, we identified sites, and some of them we've investigated, but then there's been other sites that come up while we have the grant, and so it's nice to have those funds available. Just provides those efficiencies. And it's city-led, but it's also really helpful to have a consultant to help administer the grant, to help keep things moving, help with the reporting, having that expert available to ask the questions. Also, it's been really helpful to be able to use the grant funds to pay for that reuse planning, and it's led to redevelopment too. It's cool to see with that Riverside North plan that we already have projects underway that happened after that plan and helped those developers kind of see those opportunities for that area. And having that Brownfield Advisory Committee also to help with helping with our Brownfield inventory. Next slide. I think that's it. So then I'll turn it over to Beth.
Thank you, Courtney. And you're a busy lady. So, well, I'm going to move right now to our evaluations, just so that everybody understands that that's really supports our program, that supports helping us design these workshops. What are we missing? What do we need to expand upon? So please, you can do this afterwards as well, but please provide a survey to us. It really helps us along. So Dana, if you could just back up one slide. Resource and resource documents go, well, you're not alone. So here's where I wanted to describe. There's some, I say beginners, but you know what? Even as an experienced practitioner, I still look at these things. I think it's a good idea. And there are a couple pieces that I think are important. MPCA's Brownfield Assessment Guidelines. The checklist here is just really more of a checklist that outlines what we've discussed today. Those free tab services, that'll be on there. Minnesota State Grant Facts, I won't read all this to you. EPA building blocks for communities, we didn't get to talk about that today, but that's something to look at. And then as you go with a lot more experience, there's the DEED program, guidance on competitively procuring a contractor, best practices for procuring services. And here is sort of my Cliff Notes version of the EPA Brownfields Grant Guidelines that outlines things like eligibility, like eligible activities, you know, what the type of parties that should be involved. Next slide, please. Next slide. And next steps. What's next? Where's your brownfield? If you don't own the property, do you have site access? Do you have an inventory of sites? Have you talked about your site with MPCA? Here's some things you could start working on now. Is your site eligible for the state and federal program? Again, time to go ahead and start talking about this now. Determine the type of EPA Brownfield grant. You can contact us, that's what we do, or absolutely the EPA is your best resource for assistance there. So we can just go next. Any questions here? I hope all of them have been answered in the chat. But if you have questions, if you could put them in chat. And Dana, if you don't mind putting up the evaluation slide again while I'm waiting on anyone to have questions. Thank you. And so I would say to finish, I'm going to show you the contacts for the speakers. That's on the net. Yeah, there you go. This gives you all the information you need about the speakers, how to get a hold of them. And we really appreciate you being present today. Let us know how we're doing with the evaluations. Next slide. And we adjourn. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for a great workshop. Thank you for being great listeners and asking questions. Bye-bye.